The Viking invasions have long been one of history's most captivating tales, violent raids, epic battles, and fearless warriors with a thirst for conquest. But how much of this story is true? Were the Vikings truly the brutal pillagers we've come to believe? Or is there more to their story than meets the eye? In this video, we'll separate fact from fiction, diving into the real history behind the Viking invasions, and uncovering the myths that have shaped our understanding of these legendary seafarers. Buckle up as we journey back to the age of the Vikings, where history and myth collide. The story of the Vikings begins not with their raids, but with their origins in Scandinavia modern day, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. These northern lands were harsh and unforgiving, where long cold winters and short intense summers created a unique environment. The Viking Age, which began around the late 8th century and continued through the 11th century, was not just about warriors. It was a time of exploration, trade, and expansion. But who exactly were the Vikings? Contrary to popular belief, the Vikings weren't a single tribe or nation. Instead, they were a collection of seafaring Norse people from various tribes. Their society was built around farming, fishing, and raiding, but they also excelled in shipbuilding and navigation. This gave them an unparalleled advantage in exploration, allowing them to travel vast distances across Europe and beyond. The Viking longship was their greatest tool, a marvel of naval engineering. Designed for speed, agility, and the ability to travel across both open seas and shallow rivers, these ships allowed the Vikings to strike unexpectedly and disappear just as quickly. The longship's shallow draft enabled them to land on beaches, making their raids swift and efficient. These ships weren't just war vessels, they were also crucial for trade and exploration, allowing the Vikings to establish trade routes as far east as Russia and as far west as North America. The Viking society was also quite advanced for its time. They had a complex legal system known as the Thing, which was an assembly where disputes were settled, and decisions were made by community members. This sense of order allowed the Vikings to form strong, unified communities, with a shared belief in honor, loyalty, and bravery. Despite the modern image of the Vikings as bloodthirsty raiders, their culture was far more multifaceted. While their reputation for pillaging and warfare is well earned, they were also traders, explorers, and settlers. The idea that the Vikings were all about violence and destruction overlooks their contributions to European history, such as establishing trading posts, founding cities, and influencing the culture of many of the lands they settled in. The Viking invasions began in 793 AD with the infamous attack on the Lindisfarne Monastery in Northumberland, England. This raid marked the beginning of a series of violent incursions into Britain and Europe. However, these attacks were not just random acts of violence, they were part of a larger pattern of expansion driven by necessity. As their lands became overpopulated and the resources began to dwindle, the Vikings were pushed outward, looking for new territories to settle, trade with, or conquer. This is where the myth of the Vikings as purely destructive raiders begins to take shape, because their raids were often sensationalized in stories passed down through the ages. But did the Vikings truly live up to their bloodthirsty reputation? Or was there more to their actions than meets the eye? As we dig deeper into their story, we'll uncover the truth behind their invasions, and the motivations that drove them to explore, conquer, and, yes, sometimes pillage. When we think of Vikings, the image that often comes to mind is that of a fierce, axe-wielding warrior with a horned helmet, charging into battle with ruthless aggression. Hollywood, history books, and popular culture have all played a significant role in shaping this perception. But the reality of Viking warriors is far more complex, and much of what we know is based on myth rather than fact. First, let's tackle the horned helmets. The idea that Vikings wore helmets with horns has been widely debunked by historians and archaeologists. In truth, Viking helmets were simple and functional, made of iron or steel, and lacked any decorative horns. The horned helmet myth likely comes from 19th century Romantic art and opera, where Viking imagery was used to evoke a sense of drama and barbarism. Real Viking helmets, such as those discovered in burial sites in Sweden, were conical or rounded and designed for protection during combat, not for theatrical flair. Now, what about the Vikings' fearsome reputation as bloodthirsty warriors? It's true that Viking raids were often violent and brutal. They attacked monasteries, villages, and towns, looting and plundering as they went. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD is perhaps the most famous example, where the Vikings ruthlessly sacked the Christian monastery, killing monks and seizing treasures. However, these raids were not just acts of senseless violence, they were strategic and motivated by survival. For many Vikings, raiding wasn't just about conquering new lands for plunder. It was a way to provide for their families and communities. Scandinavia's harsh climate and limited arable land created a constant struggle for resources. The Vikings, skilled shipbuilders and navigators, took to the seas not only to expand their reach, but to find new sources of wealth. Their raids were often followed by attempts to settle and trade in the areas they conquered, laying the foundation for Viking colonies in places like Ireland, England, and even parts of modern-day Russia. Interestingly, not all Vikings were warriors. In fact, many of them were farmers, traders, and craftsmen who played key roles in Viking society. The Viking Age was a period of rapid expansion, not just in terms of military conquest, but also in terms of trade. Viking merchants established trading routes across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, exchanging goods such as furs, amber, and slaves for silver, spices, and other treasures. This was a critical aspect of Viking life, and many Vikings lived in relative peace, only engaging in warfare when it was necessary for survival or expansion. Moreover, the Viking social structure was quite advanced. At the top were the kings and jarls noblemen, but the majority of the population consisted of free farmers and craftsmen known as carls. These individuals had the right to own land, participate in the thing a governing assembly, and bear arms in defense of their community. The Vikings also had a class of slaves, or thralls, who performed the labor but had no personal freedoms. This social hierarchy, though rigid, allowed for a complex and functioning society, where everyone had a role to play. Viking women, contrary to what some myths suggest, were not simply passive bystanders in this warrior culture. Women had a relatively high status in Viking society. They could own property, divorce their husbands, and even inherit land. Some women, such as Lagertha, the legendary shield maiden, have been romanticized in modern media, but there are records of real Viking women who fought in battle. However, these instances were rare. Most women's roles revolved around managing households, weaving, and raising children. In the end, while the Viking warrior is an iconic image, it represents just one facet of Viking life. Most Vikings were not warriors, but rather farmers, traders, and builders. The brutality of their raids was part of their story, but it is not the full picture. The Vikings were much more than the raiders and conquerors. They've often been made out to be. They were a society that thrived on trade, its exploration, and innovation, laying the groundwork for many of the cultural exchanges that would shape Europe in the centuries to come. While the popular image of Vikings often revolves around their raids, another essential part of their legacy lies in their expansion and settlements across vast territories. The Vikings were not merely pillagers. They were explorers, colonizers, and settlers who established a vast network of territories, some of which became lasting parts of European history. From their homeland in Scandinavia, the Vikings traveled and settled in regions as far west as North America and as far east as Russia, spreading their influence and leaving behind traces of their culture. One of the most famous Viking settlements was in the British Isles. Starting in the late 8th century, the Vikings began to raid the coasts of England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. These raids, which started as surprise attacks on monasteries and coastal towns, gradually evolved into more permanent settlements. In England, the Vikings established the Danelaw, a region under Viking control, which covered much of northern and eastern England. The city of York, once known as Jorvik, became a thriving Viking center, with a bustling market and impressive Viking architecture. The Viking presence in Ireland was also significant. In addition to their raids, they established several settlements, including the cities of Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford. These settlements became important trade hubs, connecting the Vikings to the wider world. Over time, many of the Viking settlers in Ireland integrated with the local Irish population, marrying into local families and adopting Irish customs. This blending of cultures led to the creation of a distinct Norse Gaelic society that had a lasting impact on the history of Ireland. The Vikings didn't limit their expansion to the British Isles. They also turned their attention to France. In 911 AD, the Viking leader Rollo negotiated a treaty with the King of France, Charles the Simple, which granted him land in what is now Normandy in exchange for swearing loyalty to the French crown. This marked the beginning of the Viking settlement in France, which eventually led to the rise of the Normans. The Normans, descendants of Vikings who had integrated into French society, would later play a pivotal role in European history, including the famous Norman conquest of England in 1066. Viking expansion didn't stop at Western Europe. To the east, Vikings known as the Varangians traveled along the rivers of Eastern Europe, establishing settlements and trading routes in what are now modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They played a crucial role in the formation of the Kievan Rus, a powerful medieval state that became a precursor to modern Russia. The Varangians are often credited with helping to establish the trade routes between Scandinavia and Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, facilitating the exchange of goods such as furs, wax, and slaves for luxury items like silk and spices. Perhaps the most remarkable example of Viking exploration and settlement was their journey to North America. Led by the legendary Norse explorer Leif Erikson, the Vikings established a settlement in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, around the year 1000 AD. This site, known as Lonso Meadows, is the earliest known European settlement in the Americas, predating Christopher Columbus by nearly 500 years. While the Viking settlement in North America was short-lived and eventually abandoned due to hostile interactions with indigenous peoples and a lack of resources, it remains a testament to the Vikings' remarkable seafaring abilities and their willingness to push the boundaries of the known world. In addition to their military conquests, Viking settlers brought with them a rich cultural heritage that influenced the regions they inhabited. Viking art, architecture, and mythology blended with local traditions, leaving behind an enduring cultural legacy. The Vikings' legacy in England, for example, can still be seen in place names, language, and customs. Many English words such as sky, window, and husband are derived from Old Norse, the language of the Vikings. While Viking expansion was primarily driven by the search for new lands, resources, and wealth, it also allowed them to contribute to the development of trade networks, cultural exchange, and political systems across Europe and beyond. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were settlers, builders, and creators of societies that shaped the course of history. In this section, we've seen how the Vikings expanded their influence through settlements, trade, and cultural exchange. They were more than the bloodthirsty warriors of popular myth. They were pioneers who established new territories, forged alliances, and left a lasting mark on the world. But as their settlements grew, so too did the complexities of their interactions with other cultures, which would eventually lead to the end of the Viking Age. The Viking Age, which spanned from the late 8th century to the 11th century, is a period marked by expansion, exploration, and conquest. However, as time went on, the Viking world began to change. What led to the decline of the Viking Age? Is it the rise of stronger kingdoms and military forces? Or did the Vikings themselves evolve into something more peaceful? Let us dive into the factors that contributed to the fall of the Viking Age and explore the lasting legacy of these extraordinary people. One of the main reasons for the decline of Viking power was the unification of larger, more centralized kingdoms in Europe. As the Vikings expanded, they encountered powerful forces that began to push back against their invasions. In England, for example, King Alfred the Great of Wessex emerged as a key figure in resisting Viking raids in the 9th century. Alfred's military reforms, including the creation of fortified towns called burhs and the establishment of a navy, has made it much harder for the Vikings to raid effectively. Eventually, the Anglo-Saxons were able to reclaim much of their land. In 1016, the Vikings, under King Canute, would only hold parts of England for a short time before the kingdom was fully unified. Similarly, in France, the rise of the Capetian dynasty, led by Hugh Capet in the 10th century, brought about a stronger and more unified kingdom that could resist Viking incursions more effectively. The Vikings, who had once dominated parts of France, found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over the territories they had settled, especially as local rulers grew stronger. The Vikings also faced increasing resistance in their homelands of Scandinavia. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, it began to take root in Viking society as well. The conversion to Christianity had a profound effect on Viking culture, shifting their focus away from raiding and warfare. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Harald Bluetooth were key in spreading Christianity in Norway and Denmark. As Christianity took hold, it altered the Viking worldview, emphasizing peace, Christian morality, and submission to the church rather than the Old Norse pagan beliefs that had glorified raiding and pillaging. Another factor that contributed to the decline of the Viking Age was the exhaustion of resources. The Viking settlements in the British Isles, Ireland, and even parts of Eastern Europe were not easy to maintain. The land that had been fertile for farming and raiding became overworked, and the supply of goods needed to sustain these settlements began to dwindle. The Vikings faced growing pressure from other nations, and their ability to continue expanding was increasingly limited. The Viking raids, once feared across Europe, were now less effective. The Viking warriors, who had been such a powerful force on the battlefield, were now part of a more integrated and settled society. Many Vikings had abandoned their old ways of life to live in the territories they had once raided. As settlers and farmers, they had less time and fewer resources for large-scale military campaigns. They were becoming part of the very societies they had once sought to conquer. The rise of a more stable and organized medieval Europe also meant the end of the Viking world as it had been known. The Vikings' ability to raid and conquer had been tied to their ships, which allowed them to move swiftly and without warning. But as Europe became more fortified, with cities and towns built to withstand sieges and attacks, the Vikings' advantage of surprise and mobility diminished. The Viking warrior class was no longer as dominant as it had been, yet even though the Viking Age declined, the Vikings' impact on world history remained profound. The cultural, political, and economic contributions they made were lasting. In the British Isles, the legacy of the Vikings can still be seen in place names, such as York Jorvik, and even in the English language. Where many words of Norse origin persist today, the Viking legal system, known as the Thing, influenced the development of European legal traditions. And their ships and navigational skills set the stage for future exploration. In Ireland, the Viking influence led to the creation of some of the country's most prominent cities, including Dublin, which became an important center of trade and culture. The Vikings left behind architectural structures, coinage, and art that still offer insight into their civilization. In Russia, the Vikings' establishment of the Kievan Rus would later lay the foundation for the rise of the Russian Empire. The legacy of Viking exploration is also evident in the Americas. The Viking settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland is a testament to their pioneering spirit. Centuries before Columbus ever sailed to the New World. Though their North American settlements were short-lived, they represent one of the earliest known European contacts with the Americas, paving the way for later explorers. While the Viking Age may have come to an end, their legacy continues to resonate across the world. Their impact on language, law, trade, and exploration shaped the course of European history and influenced the cultures they came into contact with. Today, the Vikings are no longer just seen as ruthless invaders. They are recognized as complex figures who helped shape the world in ways that continue to be felt today. Their story is one of exploration, innovation, and cultural exchange, a reminder that history is often more nuanced than the myths we tell.